Hi. Audiofuse 16 rig is Arturia's proposed solution for people who own a large number of synths and effects and are looking for a central hub for matrix routing and mixing of audio, where everything can remain connected and work together, whether standalone as a mixer or as an audio interface alongside a computer. There are quite a few companies making interfaces in this form factor. In this video, I'll go over all of 16 rig's main features and compare how they fare versus the competition. Before I start, a quick disclosure. Arturia sent 16 rig to me. No money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. This channel is funded mainly by viewers who subscribe to exclusive content and book updates on Patreon, which includes a comprehensive audio interface buyer's guide. Okay, let's jump right in. One of the main things that impact the cost and size of an audio interface or mixer is the number of inputs and outputs it has on board, because each converter adds to the cost, and whether if and how many of the inputs have microphone preamps, because those add to the cost too. Since the focus of 16 rig is mainly synths and effects, while it has 16 TRS balanced inputs, only 2 of those have preamps with phantom power. So if that's all you'll be recording simultaneously, you're fine. But if you need to use more than 2 microphones for simultaneous recording, you'll need either an interface with more preamps or to add an ADAT preamp expander to this. These preamps, by the way, aren't the discrete Pro type preamps like on other Audiofuses, meaning that they don't have separate circuits for the line and preamp components, and they don't have the 10 dB boost option like on other Audiofuses, but I tried them with the notoriously low-level Shure SM7B and they amplified it just fine. Testing, the SM7B. Aside from mic preamps, another thing you may want to be on the lookout for is the number of high Z or instrument level inputs. And by instrument, the reference is to specific instruments like electric guitars that require high Z impedance inputs. On 16 rig, only the 2 front inputs support high Z. So again, you'll only be able to record 2 high Z instruments at a time and at the expense of the mic preamps. Finally, on the input side, Arturia did something extremely useful I've not seen on any other interface, a 3.5mm stereo input here on the front. So you can record synths that have that kind of output without requiring you to get a 1/4-inch splitter / adapter or reach behind to the back. Let's move on and talk about the analog outputs. Generally, when looking at interfaces and mixers, a similar cost rule applies on the output side. The more outputs, the more the interface is going to cost. Here too, Arturia made a synth and effects setup decision to provide fewer outputs than inputs, which isn't the case on all interfaces. And this makes sense in a synth setup. You'll typically have more devices coming in than devices that process audio. If that's not the case for you, then obviously you'll need to either get a different interface or expand this one with ADAT outputs. Note that some interfaces and mixers come with XLR outputs. You'll likely need to buy adapters if your synths and effects don't have XLR inputs, which is often the case. 16 rig also has something pretty unique I've not seen anywhere else. Outputs 3 and 4 have copies out front. Not only that, you can also configure them to do one of a few things. If you leave them as is, the default routing has them mirroring the outputs on the back. You can then plug in a stereo effect and then feed the outputs from that effect back into the 2 inputs. But they've got a few other configurations. If we go into the outputs and click in to enter their configuration page, there are 3 other options for this. The reamp option changes their impedance, so they'll fake being a guitar to an amp, for example. The direct through option will mirror inputs 1 and 2 without going through the interface. And then the alt phones is an interesting one. This will turn each of outputs 3 and 4 to stereo outputs. Obviously, this means that outputs 3 and 4 now become unbalanced, but you can use that to connect to, say, stereo effects like this, which have a single TRS stereo input, or just as separate headphone outputs. Note, however, that unlike the main headphone output, these don't provide enough juice to properly power high impedance headphones. And one more option for the outputs. Aside from the main monitor output, you can also choose to have 2 additional outputs assigned to another pair of speakers. If you do that, you can also go into the settings and set a trim for the second pair of monitors and choose which outputs you want to assign to them. And then this button will toggle between the 2. While we're here, you can also configure this button to dim or mono the monitor output. Just to complete the coverage of the output situation, you've got two phone outputs. They're mirrored, 1/4 inch and one 3.5 millimeter. Moving on from inputs and outputs, another important thing you need to consider when looking at interfaces for synths and effects is whether the interface is just an interface, meaning that it sends audio back and forth from and to your computer, or whether in addition to that, it also has a built-in mixer and, better yet, a built-in matrix router. So what are these things and why do you need them? Having a built-in mixer means that you can create low latency mixes directly on the interface without using a computer or DAW. And then a few follow-up questions would be how capable that mixer is, whether it has built-in effects, and how many mixes you can create. In 16 rig, you've got two mixes, a main mix and a Q mix. You can choose as many channels as you like for either of these mixes, but they're not quite the same. The Q mix doesn't have any auxiliary sends, whereas the main mix has up to 4 mono sends or 2 stereo sends. Both mixers have levels, panning, mutes, and solos, and then, like I mentioned, aux levels and mutes for the main mix. You can also choose if these are pre or post fader. A bit about customization: you can name the names of these inputs. As long as they're connected to analog inputs, you can't, at least not in this firmware, rename the USB inputs. And as you add channels, I think they should also add a tooltip with channel names here when you select the different inputs you want in the mixer. And like I mentioned, you can't currently rename USB inputs. This is audio coming in from your DAW. I think that could be pretty useful as you set up software instruments in your DAW and you want to route them to different hardware destinations. You also can't rename auxiliary sends, at least not as far as I saw, which would be nice. You determine where these go in the routing matrix. So that's the main mix. Like I mentioned, there's a Q mix without any sends. Whether or not either of these is important to you really depends on your workflow. If you're just planning to send audio into your DAW and from your DAW back to external instruments, then you might not use these at all. Going back and forth to your DAW obviously adds latency, whereas latency here is minimal. And of course, the advantage of having a built-in mixer is that you don't need to turn on your computer if you just want a quick jam with whatever you've got connected to your setup. So that's the internal mixer. Alongside this mixer, 16 rig also has a matrix router built in. This very massive matrix lets you take audio coming in from the analog inputs of 16 rig, any ADAT audio coming in, we'll get to that in a bit, USB audio coming in from your DAW, the main mix, the auxiliary sends, and the Q mix, and then route these to any one of the outputs, any one of the destinations that are available. Outputs to your DAW, that's USB, ADAT, analog, phones, and the main monitor. So for example, here I've got the stereo pair coming from the main mix going out to Cosmos in this case, then mono mixes going out to Analog Core 60 and KFM. If I wanted to, just for fun, I could take audio coming in from Cosmos and then route that anywhere I wanted to additional effects, create an additional effects chain. Say for example, route that audio, stereo audio, into GenLoss. Then I could continue to route that audio from GenLoss to anywhere I wanted, or just pick it up in the mixer. So for example, here GenLoss is coming in on ADAT inputs 1 and 2. This is where I mentioned that it would be nice had there been labels on this page. Anyway, pick it up on ADAT inputs 9 and 10, which are 1 and 2 on ADAT number 2. And we now have that coming in here into the mixer. This workflow, I think, is a really fast way to have audio zipping in and out and around on your setup. And it is indeed nice that you can rename all the inputs and outputs. Not all interfaces let you do that. There are some limitations to this matrix. So I could, for example, take Cosmos as a source and route that also to the H9000 for further processing. So you can split signals to multiple destinations, but you can't use this as a mixer. So you can't combine another source into this. Say if I wanted to have the OBX8 go into the H9000 as well, that would automatically disable Cosmos and vice versa. If you did want to combine two sources, you could, for example, then say use the Q mix for that. Then you could also determine levels for those sources, but you've only got two of those mixes, the Q mix and the main mix. So that's mixing and matrix routing. Let's move on and talk about hands-on controls. In a form factor like this, hands-on controls is going to be the biggest compromise compared to audio interfaces with more hands-on controls, say like Audiofuse Studio, or mixers that are also audio interfaces. Now, you can actually control quite a few of 16 rig's parameters using this carousel and menu-like interface. Just to show you how extreme this is, say I could go into the mixer, then go through the individual channels, even to the extent of adding different sources into the mixer. So you could do that, but obviously it's way easier to just use the software. One of the few things that you can't do, at least not currently, by the way, is indeed edit the matrix through this, but you can do, I think, pretty much everything else. You navigate these menus with this main encoder, and you go into a menu by pressing it. There's a back button here. There are also shortcuts to various places within the interface. There are handy shortcuts for inputs 1 and 2. So if you want to, say, quickly connect a microphone and, say, adjust the gain or turn on phantom power, an option which will appear had I had an XLR cable plugged in here. There are also a few useful key combo shortcuts here. So if I exit this menu and then want to change the gain of input 1 or 2, just hold the input and then turn the monitor knob to adjust its gain directly. You can also quickly move between the different inputs, and it's nice to see the names of the inputs on screen if you configure that in the software. You can also quickly go through and dive in to the specific inputs or outputs. So a lot can be controlled here, but frankly, in the month or so that I've been using this, I've been using the software mainly for pretty much everything, and maybe these just to quickly set gains for the inputs if I'm using a microphone here. For the most part, I just use the Audiofuse Control Center application. There are Mac and PC versions of this, but no iPad version. If you want to control this with a tablet, unfortunately, currently you can't. Overall, there are 5 tabs. You can see levels for everything connected, going in and out. We went through the main mixer and the Q mixer, as well as the routing matrix. There are MIDI mapping controls, which we'll get to, and then you've got settings. So that's pretty much it for the control center. Pretty straightforward and easy to use, I think. And then this does indeed bring us to MIDI mapping. So the idea here is that you can take any MIDI controller, but presumably, preferably one that has plenty of mixer controls, plug that in to the MIDI input here. Now this doesn't have, at least not as of the current firmware, automatic mapping for MCU style controllers. MCU is a standard whereby controllers like these, with or without motorized faders and knobs, can talk back and forth with mixers. So at least currently you'll need to do the MIDI mapping manually, which doesn't take too long. Just touch a control and then map it. Let's do this quickly. Maybe also map pens. Let's see if mutes and solos work here. I'll just try a few. Mute, mute, and solo and solo. Let's map the main mix to this. And I could actually choose different pages here to map the auxiliary sends and also map these to swap pages. But let's settle for this. Go back into the mixer. And now this should work, which it doesn't because I didn't enable USB host control. And now back to the mixer. The main level works with this knob. The faders work nicely, as do the pan controls. As far as the mute and solo go, they're set to momentary operation in this controller's configuration. I checked and you can change that to a toggle, which is what needs to be done for this to work properly in this case. And then one more thing that I wanted to add, while you can MIDI map the main mixer, you can't MIDI map the Q mixer, and you also can't map any of the non-mixer controls. For me, I would have found it useful to map gain controls here, for example, to an external MIDI controller. So for example, if you've got a surround or even a quadraphonic setup, it would be nice to be able to control levels for the different speakers, or just to increase or reduce levels overall for all the speakers in your setup. Next up, an important parameter to consider when getting an audio interface is how expandable it is. While 16 inputs and 10 outputs may seem like a lot, the synth and effects Surgeon General warns they can be addictive and you might need more I/O. One of the most popular and cost-effective ways to expand audio interfaces is using ADAT optical cables. You'll see quite a few audio interfaces with an ADAT input and output pair, which lets you send and receive 8 channels at once at up to 48 kilohertz or 4 channels at once at up to 96 kilohertz. Some interfaces have 2 pairs of these. That doesn't automatically mean that they can support 16 ADAT channels. For example, Arturia's 8-pre uses 2 pairs to send and receive 8 channels at 96 kilohertz, but it can't accommodate 16 channels. On 16 rig, you do have that choice. So you've got 2 pairs of ADAT I/O, and you can use them to receive 16 audio channels over ADAT or to send 16 audio channels. As long as you're at up to 48 kilohertz, if you go beyond to 96, then you'll only have half the channels. And to my knowledge, ADAT doesn't support higher rates at all. So if for some reason you want to work at 192 kilohertz, you won't be able to use any of the ADAT ports, and it will also cut out some of your analog inputs and apparently the loopback channels as well. Unless you're making BAT recordings, I don't think there's a reason to do this. And at 48, everything's available. A few things you need to be aware of. Once you start expanding your interface with ADAT or anything else, you'll need to be mindful of clocking. If you're adding just one ADAT interface, you can sync clock over the ADAT cables. 16 rig doesn't send or receive clock over the second ADAT pair. To sync 2 interfaces with this, you'll need to use a word clock cable. Actually, 2 of these daisy chained through your 2 other interfaces. So ADAT is the only way to expand 16 rig. You should be aware of other interfaces that have other means of expansion, like the popular optical-based MIDI and the network-based Dante and AES67, which I covered in my Digital Matrix Synth Setups video, linked below. Let's move on and talk about another potentially important thing you might want to look at when you choose an audio interface. I touched on this earlier, and that's DSP effects, meaning audio effects that live on the interface itself. As far as 16 rig goes, this section is going to be short. It just doesn't have any. No EQs, no compressors, reverbs, or delays. There are a few reasons you may want DSP effects on an interface. One could be to offload CPU resources from your computer to DSP on the interface, or if there are effects you can only get on the DSP, which is pretty rare. Another could be if you need 0 latency effects when recording instruments into your computer or when tracking vocals. And then another could be basic per-track mixer effects like EQ or compression that you may want to apply to a live mix. DSP effects are nice, but can obviously greatly increase the cost of an interface. Interfaces by companies like Universal Audio and Antelope are known for their extensive effects offerings, both bundled and paid extras, but some interfaces have basic built-in effects like those by RME and Motu, things like EQ, compression, and even basic delays and reverbs. Moving on, many audio interfaces come bundled with a simple MIDI interface. You'll typically see a single MIDI in and out, and that's that. 16 rig has 2 MIDI outputs, each separately addressable in your computer. Then it's got an analog clock output that's synced to MIDI. And then finally, it can also act as a USB MIDI host. Now, by default, all the USB and 5-pin MIDI DIN ports feed into your computer over USB-C. And if you want to link one to the other, you'll need to do it in your DAW or some other computer-based MIDI router. But if you switch the MIDI mode to standalone, then you've got a simple 2-input, 4-output MIDI router built in. The 2 inputs are either the USB host port or the MIDI input in the back. And then you can route these to one of 4 destinations, one of the 2 DIN outputs, the analog sync output, and you can also route MIDI out to the USB host. Before I summarize the pros and cons, a few miscellaneous things that are good to know. 16 rig has 2 more USB Type A ports beside this one in the front and another in the back. These are just simple USB 2.0 hosts, and it may seem silly, but actually comes in quite handy. My main computer is a MacBook Pro with a USB hub connected, and I still use these quite a lot because 16 rig is in a different location. Do note, however, that this is a USB 2.0 hub, not the higher speed USB 3.0. And then a few more features you might find in other interfaces, and not here. This doesn't have a talkback microphone or button, of course, and there's no option to record individual tracks or the main mix to a USB stick. If you want to record anything, you'll need to do that on your DAW on your computer. Okay, let's sum things up. Both the pros and the cons for 16 rig are that it does what it's aimed to do, meaning if you want a hub for a lot of synths and effects, this is an excellent solution at a relatively reasonable and competitive price. The number of inputs and outputs is fine-tuned for that kind of setup. The front panel access to different input and output types is a major pro. Because this has 1/4-inch cables, you won't need a DB25 adapter or a patch bay. And this doesn't take up much space. It's only 1 U in your rack. And if you don't have a rack, I guess you can put a synth or drum machine on it, just don't block the grill. And beside the extensive existing I/O, This is easily expandable via ADAT if your synth situation gets out of hand. I've been using this as my main interface for all my videos over the past month or so, and testing it with my setup when it's not on this desk, with 2 interfaces connected over ADAT and word clock. And in terms of audio quality, I think it's there, but you tell me. If you're a subscriber, you've been listening to it for a while. The cons are that if you need an interface for other uses than a lot of synths and effects, then there may be better alternatives. For example, sending more than 2 low latency mixes at a time to different members of a band, or creating a recording that requires more than just 2 preamps or 2 high Z inputs simultaneously. Or if you need more hands-on controls, obviously at the expense of taking up more space, then this isn't the interface for you. Also, while it has basic mixing capabilities and the MIDI mapping feature works well, if you are looking for other mixer amenities like per-channel EQ or compression or other built-in effects, this doesn't have them. Also, for me personally, while a surprising number of functions are available using this encoder, the back button, and the screen, except for level metering and controlling the gains of these inputs, I used the software for pretty much everything. On the firmware wishlist side, while it's easy to create mixes and routings using the software, and the ability to rename the inputs and the outputs is a major time saver, I am missing the ability to rename the USB inputs and destinations. You can't do that in this firmware. And like I mentioned earlier, when you add tracks in the mixer, it would be nice to have a tooltip to remind you what each of these is. Like I mentioned earlier, MIDI mapping for the mixer is nice, but it would be even better to control parameters outside the mixer using an external MIDI controller. Then, at the risk of stating the almost obvious, the interface can't be bus powered. It needs the included power supply. And then finally, when you adjust monitor levels, while you can see it on screen here, I think it should be shown more prominently. If you go to the outputs and then dive into the main output, then you will see a nice visual representation of monitor levels. But I think that's something you should see at all times when you touch this knob, even if you're on a different screen. So that's it for 16 rig. There's a whole audio interface buyer's guide and plenty more in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.